The Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly under the merciless Arizona sun, its ancient arms reaching toward the Santa Catalina Mountains like a prayer frozen in time. Detective Ray Hoffman wiped the sweat from his forehead as he stepped out of his patrol car, the heat hitting him like a physical blow even at 7 in the morning. The temperature gauge on his dashboard already read 92 degrees, and it was only June 15, 1981. "Christ, it's going to be a scorcher today," muttered his partner, Detective Mike Torres, emerging from the passenger side. The younger officer had been with Tucson PD for only 2 years, but the desert had already begun to etch its harsh lines around his eyes. The call had come in at dawn from a group of hikers who'd ventured out early to beat the heat. They'd found something in a wash about 15 miles northeast of the city, something that had made even the most seasoned desert rat among them turn pale and stumble back to their truck to call for help. Hoffman followed the narrow dirt trail that wound between towering saguaro cacti and clusters of palo verde trees. The desert was deceptively quiet, broken only by the distant call of a coyote and the crunch of gravel under their boots. But there was something else in the air today, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In his 23 years with the force, he'd learned to trust that feeling. There, Torres pointed ahead, to where a group of uniformed officers had already cordoned off the area with yellow tape. The wash cut through the landscape like an old scar, its sandy bottom dotted with smooth river rocks and the bleached remains of desert brush. As they approached, Hoffman could see why the hikers had been so shaken. At the bottom of the wash, partially hidden beneath a creosote bush, lay a woman. Even from a distance, he could see that she was badly injured, her clothes torn and stained with blood that had turned dark in the desert heat. "Is she—" Torres began, but his question was answered when they heard a faint moan echoing up from the wash. "She's alive," called Officer Janet Phillips, who had been first on the scene. "Barely, but she's breathing. Ambulance is en route." Hoffman carefully made his way down the steep bank, his boots sliding on the loose sand. Up close, the woman's condition was even more horrifying. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in cuts and bruises that suggested she'd been beaten severely. Her dark hair was matted with blood and sand, and her clothes, a simple white blouse and blue jeans, were shredded as if she'd been dragged through the thorny desert vegetation. But what caught Hoffman's attention was her right hand, clenched tightly around something even in her unconscious state. He knelt beside her, careful not to disturb what might be evidence, and gently tried to see what she was holding. "What is it, Ray?" Torres called from above. "Some kind of pendant or necklace," Hoffman replied, pulling out his camera to document the scene before the paramedics arrived. The woman stirred slightly at his voice, her lips moving as if she was trying to speak, but no words came out. The pendant appeared to be made of silver, tarnished black in places, with strange markings that didn't look like any language Hoffman recognized. In the center was a dark stone that seemed to absorb the desert sunlight rather than reflect it. Something about it made him uneasy, though he couldn't put his finger on why. In the distance, the wail of sirens grew louder, bouncing off the canyon walls like the cry of some ancient spirit. The woman's breathing became more labored, and Hoffman found himself leaning closer, straining to hear if she might say something that could help identify her or her attacker. "Hold on," he whispered, though he doubted she could hear him. "Help's coming." As the paramedics worked to stabilize her for transport to Tucson Medical Center, Hoffman continued photographing the scene. The desert around the wash showed signs of a struggle: scuffed sand, broken branches on nearby shrubs, and what looked like tire tracks leading back toward the main road. But there was something else, something that would haunt him for years to come. As he snapped pictures of the woman's battered face, trying to capture enough detail for a potential identification, he noticed that despite the severe trauma, there was an expression of peace on what remained of her features. Not the peace of unconsciousness, but something deeper, as if even in her pain she had found what she was looking for. The pendant remained clutched in her hand as they loaded her into the ambulance, and Hoffman made a note that it would need to be carefully removed and catalogued as evidence once she reached the hospital. He had no way of knowing that this single photograph, this moment frozen in time, would survive fires that would consume everything around it, waiting patiently for 34 years to reveal its impossible secret. The fluorescent lights of Tucson Medical Center's intensive care unit hummed with an electric persistence that made Detective Hoffman's teeth ache. He'd been pacing the sterile hallway for 3 hours, waiting for word on the woman they'd found in the desert. The pendant had been carefully removed from her grasp, and now sat in an evidence bag in his jacket pocket, its weight seeming far heavier than such a small object should. Doctor. Patricia Reeves emerged from the ICU, pulling off her surgical gloves with the weary motion of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. Her expression told Hoffman everything he needed to know before she even spoke. "She's stable, but barely," Dr. Reeves said, her voice carrying the weight of difficult news. "Multiple fractures to the skull and facial bones, severe dehydration, and internal bleeding that we've managed to control for now." "Detective, I have to ask, how long was she out there?" Hoffman shook his head. "We're not sure. The hikers found her this morning, but given the condition of the blood and the level of dehydration, I'd guess she'd been there at least 2 days, maybe longer." "That's what I was afraid of." The doctor's frown deepened. "The strange thing is, some of her injuries don't match that timeline. The facial trauma looks fresh, maybe 12 hours old, but the dehydration suggests much longer exposure. It's like she was injured twice at different times." Torres approached from the waiting area, holding a steaming cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since the Carter administration. "Any word from missing persons?" "Nothing that matches," Hoffman replied, taking the offered coffee and immediately regretting it. "No reports of missing women in the past week that fit her description. I've got Phillips running her fingerprints, but if she's not in the system, we're looking at a Jane Doe situation." Dr. Reeves glanced between the two detectives. "There's something else, something I've never seen before." She hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "When we removed that pendant she was holding, her vital signs spiked dramatically. Heart rate, blood pressure, everything. It was like she was fighting to hold on to it, even unconscious." "Any idea what it is?" Torres asked. "Not a clue. It's not like any religious symbol I recognize. The markings look almost ancient, pre-Columbian maybe. You might want to have someone at the university take a look at it." Hoffman nodded, making a mental note to contact the anthropology department at the University of Arizona. Professor Elizabeth Santos had helped the department before with artifacts found at crime scenes, though usually they involved smuggled pottery, not mysterious pendants clutched by dying women. "Can we see her?" Hoffman asked. Dr. Reeves led them through the maze of medical equipment to a private room where their Jane Doe lay surrounded by monitors and IV lines. The cleaning and medical treatment had revealed more of her features, but the swelling still made identification nearly impossible. She appeared to be in her late 20s, with dark hair and olive skin that suggested Hispanic heritage. "We'll need dental records for a positive ID," Dr. Reeves continued. "But there's something odd about her teeth too. She has several fillings, but they're not contemporary work. The techniques and materials look like they're from the 1950s or early 1960s. Torres frowned. "That doesn't make sense. She can't be more than 30. "That's what I thought too," the doctor replied. "But the dental work doesn't lie. Either she had some very old-fashioned dentistry or—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the impossible alternative. As they stood around her bed, the woman's eyes suddenly fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and held a depth that seemed far older than her apparent age. Her gaze fixed on Hoffman with startling clarity, and her lips moved soundlessly. "Can you tell us your name?" Hoffman asked gently, leaning closer to the bed. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, dry as desert sand. Elena Vasquez." Torres quickly pulled out his notebook. "Elena, can you tell us what happened to you? Who did this?" But her eyes had already closed again, and the monitors showed she'd slipped back into unconsciousness. "Doctor," Reeves checked her pulse and shook her head. "She's exhausted. It may be hours or days before she's conscious enough to answer questions again." Back at the station, Hoffman ran the name Elena Vasquez through every database available to the Tucson Police Department in 1981. The computers were primitive by future standards, but they covered local records, state databases, and federal files for anyone with a criminal history. The search came back empty. "Maybe she's from Mexico," suggested Officer Phillips, looking over his shoulder at the green text scrolling across the monitor. "Could be here illegally, which would explain why there's no record of her." "Maybe," Hoffman agreed, though something about that explanation didn't sit right with him. The woman's English had been unaccented, and her clothes, while simple, were clearly American-made. He pulled the evidence bag containing the pendant from his desk drawer and held it up to the light. In the harsh fluorescent glare of the police station, the markings seemed even more mysterious. They weren't quite symbols, not quite letters, but something in between that hurt to look at for too long. As the day wore on, Hoffman found himself returning to the pendant again and again. There was something about it that nagged at him, beyond its obvious strangeness. It felt familiar somehow, like a half-remembered dream or a song heard in childhood. That night, as he drove home through the desert darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that Elena Vasquez's story was far from over. The pendant sat in the evidence locker at the station, but its presence seemed to follow him, a weight he couldn't shed. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert, their voices carrying ancient secrets that the land had kept for millennia. Hoffman shivered despite the warm night air, wondering what other mysteries lay buried beneath the sand and stone of the desert that surrounded his city. The photograph he'd taken that morning sat in the case file, waiting to be developed and catalogued. Neither he nor anyone else could have imagined that it would outlive archives, survive fires, and wait patiently for technology that didn't yet exist to reveal the impossible truth about Elena Vasquez. The University of Arizona's anthropology building felt like a sanctuary from the blazing afternoon heat. Professor Elizabeth Santos adjusted her reading glasses as she examined the pendant under a high-powered magnifying lamp, her weathered hands moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent decades handling ancient artifacts. Detective Hoffman sat across from her cluttered desk, surrounded by pottery shards, books in a dozen languages, and photographs of archaeological digs stretching back to the 1960s. The office smelled of old paper and the faint chemical tang of preservation solutions. "This is extraordinary," Professor Santos murmured, her voice carrying a mixture of fascination and unease. "Where did you say you found this?" "It was clutched in the hand of an injured woman we discovered in the desert," Hoffman replied, watching her face carefully for any sign of recognition. "She identified herself as Elena Vasquez, but we can't find any records of her existence." Santos looked up from the pendant, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence and something else, concern perhaps or fear. "Detective, these markings aren't from any known pre-Columbian culture in this region. They're much older, and they don't belong here at all." "What do you mean they don't belong here?" She rotated the pendant under the light, pointing to specific symbols with a thin metal probe. "These characters are similar to inscriptions I've seen in photographs from sites in Turkey and Lebanon. Ancient Mesopotamian influences, possibly Sumerian in origin. But this particular combination..." She paused, reaching for a thick reference book. "I've seen something like this once before." Hoffman leaned forward. "Where?" "In my graduate studies at Berkeley 30 years ago, my advisor, Dr. Marcus Webb, showed me a photograph of similar markings found on artifacts recovered from a mass grave in Syria in the 1920s. But those pieces were lost during World War II, and the site was destroyed by bombing." Santos continued examining the pendant, making notes in a leather-bound journal. "The stone in the center is interesting too. It's not obsidian or jet, as I first thought. It's something I've never encountered before. It seems to absorb light rather than reflect it." As she spoke, the afternoon sun streaming through the office window dimmed, as if clouds were passing overhead. But when Hoffman glanced outside, the sky remained clear and mercilessly blue. "Professor, what did Dr. Webb tell you about those Syrian artifacts?" Santos closed the reference book and removed her glasses, cleaning them with nervous precision. "He said they were found with the remains of an entire village that had vanished overnight, sometime in the 3rd century AD. No signs of violence, no evidence of plague or natural disaster, just empty buildings and this mass grave filled with people who appeared to have died peacefully in their sleep. That's unusual for a mass burial." "What was more unusual," Santos continued, "was that many of the bodies were found clutching similar pendants. Dr. Webb theorized that they were part of some kind of death cult, but the local authorities burned everything before proper studies could be conducted. They said the site was cursed." Hoffman felt a chill despite the desert heat outside. "Cursed how?" "The excavation team reported strange dreams, equipment failures, and several members fell seriously ill with symptoms the local doctors couldn't identify. 3 archaeologists died during the dig, all under mysterious circumstances." She paused, looking directly at Hoffman. "Dr. Webb never talked about that dig again after showing me those photographs. He seemed genuinely frightened by what they'd found. As if summoned by their conversation, the pendant began to emit a barely perceptible humming sound. Both Hoffman and Santos stared at it, watching as the dark stone in its center seemed to pulse with an inner light that hurt to look at directly. "Has it done that before?" Santos asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, never." Hoffman reached out to touch the evidence bag containing the pendant, but Santos grabbed his wrist. "Don't." "Not directly." She pulled a pair of thick cotton gloves from her desk drawer and carefully moved the pendant to a lead-lined box used for storing radioactive samples. The humming stopped immediately, but the feeling of unease in the room lingered. "Detective, I think you need to find out more about this Elena Vasquez. If she was carrying this pendant, she was involved in something far more dangerous than a simple assault." Santos locked the box and handed Hoffman a small key. "I'd like to keep this overnight, run some tests, but I want you to take precautions." "What kind of precautions?" "Don't handle it directly. Don't let it out of your sight for extended periods. And whatever you do, don't let your Jane Doe near it again." "Why not?" Santos walked to her window, gazing out at the Catalina Mountains, rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. "Dr. Webb told me something else about those Syrian artifacts. The people found in that mass grave, they were all reported missing from villages and towns hundreds of miles away. Somehow, they'd all been drawn to that one place to die. You think this pendant could do something similar?" "I don't know, Detective, but that woman you found was carrying it in the middle of the desert, miles from anywhere, with injuries that don't make medical sense. If she survives, you need to find out how she got that pendant and why it called her to that particular place." As Hoffman left the university and drove back toward the station, he couldn't shake Professor Santos's words. The idea that the pendant might be some kind of beacon, drawing people to their deaths, seemed impossible. But in his 23 years of police work, he'd learned that the impossible often turned out to be merely improbable. That evening, he called Tucson Medical Center to check on Elena Vasquez. Dr. Reeves informed him that her condition had worsened during the afternoon. Her heart rate had become erratic, and she'd begun speaking in her sleep, not in English or Spanish, but in what sounded like a much older language that none of the staff recognized. As Hoffman hung up the phone, he realized that Elena's deterioration had begun around the same time he'd taken the pendant to Professor Santos. The connection might be coincidence, but in his gut he knew it wasn't. Something was calling Elena Vasquez, and he was beginning to suspect that death might be the only way she could answer that call. Elena Vasquez died at 3:17 a.m. on June 18, 1981, exactly 3 days after she'd been found in the desert wash. Detective Hoffman received the call from Dr. Reeves just as he was pouring his first cup of coffee, the pre-dawn darkness of his kitchen suddenly feeling oppressive and cold. "I'm sorry, Detective," Dr. Reeves said, her voice heavy with exhaustion and something else, confusion, perhaps even fear. "We did everything we could, but her body just gave up. The strange thing is, her injuries were actually healing. The internal bleeding had stopped, the swelling was going down, there was no medical reason for her to die." Hoffman drove through the empty streets of Tucson, the city still sleeping under a blanket of desert stars. At the hospital, he found Dr. Reeves waiting for him in the same ICU hallway where they'd first discussed Elena's mysterious condition. "What happened?" he asked. "Around midnight, she became agitated, speaking in that strange language again. We sedated her, but it didn't help. She kept reaching for something, clawing at the air like she was trying to grab onto something we couldn't see." Dr. Reeves paused, rubbing her temples. "The monitors showed massive brain activity, more than we should see even in someone having seizures. Then at exactly 3:17, everything just stopped. I need to see her." In the sterile quiet of the morgue, Elena Vasquez looked peaceful for the first time since Hoffman had found her. The swelling in her face had diminished enough to reveal delicate features that spoke of mixed heritage, perhaps Mexican and Native American. But it was her expression that struck him most. She looked satisfied, as if she'd finally found what she was looking for. "Detective," Dr. Reeves said quietly, "there's something else. When she died, every piece of electrical equipment in the ICU malfunctioned for exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. The nurses are convinced the place is haunted now." Hoffman spent the morning completing the paperwork that would officially close the case. Elena Vasquez would be buried as a Jane Doe, her few possessions catalogued as evidence in a case with no suspect and no motive. The pendant remained locked in Professor Santos's lead-lined box, awaiting further analysis that might never come. But the desert, it seemed, wasn't finished with Elena's story. On July 4, 1981, as Tucson celebrated Independence Day with fireworks that echoed like gunshots across the valley, Elena Vasquez's body disappeared from the county morgue. The security guard, Thomas Mitchell, a 20-year veteran with an unblemished record, swore he'd locked the facility properly before leaving for the night. The cameras showed no sign of forced entry, no evidence of theft. The body was simply gone. "This doesn't make sense," Torres muttered, studying the empty drawer that had held Elena's remains. Who steals a corpse and why? Hoffman had no answers, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Elena had left the morgue the same way she'd arrived in their lives, under her own power, drawn by forces none of them understood. The case file grew thicker over the following weeks, as Hoffman pursued every lead no matter how unlikely. He interviewed mortuary workers, checked with local medical schools that might use cadavers for research, and even contacted Mexican authorities in case someone had claimed the body for burial across the border. Nothing. Elena Vasquez had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, leaving behind only the photograph Hoffman had taken in the desert wash, the mysterious pendant, and a growing certainty that this case would haunt him for the rest of his career. 17 years later, on a sweltering August night in 1998, that certainty would prove prophetic. Fire trucks screamed through the streets of downtown Tucson, their sirens wailing like banshees as they raced toward the police headquarters building. By the time they arrived, the entire records division was engulfed in flames that seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity, consuming decades of case files, evidence lockers, and archived photographs. Detective Ray Hoffman, now a 20-year veteran approaching retirement, stood in the parking lot watching his professional life turn to ash. The fire had started in the basement storage area, where the oldest files were kept, spreading upward with impossible speed. Investigators would later determine that the blaze had reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, far beyond what any normal fire should achieve. "How bad is it?" asked Chief Patricia Morrison, arriving at the scene with her hair still in curlers and her badge pinned to a hastily donned bathrobe. "Everything from 1960 to 1985 is gone," reported Fire Captain James Rodriguez. "The sprinkler system failed completely, and the fire suppression equipment malfunctioned. It's like the building wanted to burn." As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, Hoffman walked through the devastation with a mixture of grief and disbelief. 40 years of police work, thousands of cases, countless photographs and pieces of evidence, all reduced to grey ash that crunched under his boots like snow. But in one corner of what had been Evidence Storage Room B, something had survived. Fire Captain Rodriguez called him over to where a small section of metal shelving remained intact, its contents somehow untouched by the inferno that had consumed everything around it. On the bottom shelf sat a single evidence box, its cardboard surface not even singed. Hoffman's hands trembled as he opened the box and found the photograph from the Elena Vasquez case, as clear and undamaged as the day it was taken. Beside it lay the evidence bag containing the pendant, its dark stone seeming to pulse with satisfaction in the morning light. "That's impossible," whispered Captain Rodriguez. "Nothing could have survived in here." But Hoffman was beginning to understand that impossibility was relative when it came to Elena Vasquez. The pendant had protected itself and her photograph, preserving them for reasons he couldn't fathom, but was beginning to fear. As he carefully placed the items in a new evidence box, Hoffman noticed something he'd never seen before. In the photograph, barely visible in the shadows behind Elena's prone form, was what looked like a figure standing among the creosote bushes. It was indistinct, possibly just a trick of light and shadow, but the longer he stared at it, the more convinced he became that someone had been watching when he'd taken this picture 17 years ago. Someone who looked remarkably like Elena Vasquez herself. 12 years had passed since the first fire, and Detective Ray Hoffman had been enjoying his retirement in a small house on the outskirts of Tucson, where the city gave way to endless desert and the nights were filled with coyote songs. At 73, his joints ached with the desert's dry heat, but his mind remained sharp, particularly when it came to the one case that had never truly left him. The Elena Vasquez file sat in his home office, contained now in a simple manila folder that seemed inadequate for the weight of its mystery. The photograph and pendant had been transferred to the new police headquarters after the 1998 fire, but Hoffman had kept copies of everything, unable to let go of the puzzle that had defined the final decades of his career. On March 15, 2010, his phone rang at 2:30 in the morning. "Ray, it's happening again." The voice belonged to Detective Lisa Chen, who had taken over Hoffman's old caseload when he retired. "The new headquarters is on fire, the whole damned records division." Hoffman drove through the night, his old pickup truck rattling over the desert roads as emergency vehicles screamed past him toward the city center. The glow on the horizon was visible from miles away, an angry orange beacon that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat against the star-filled sky. The scene at the new police headquarters was devastatingly familiar. Flames that burned too hot, sprinkler systems that failed at crucial moments, and that same supernatural intensity that had marked the 1998 fire. Fire Chief Maria Santos, daughter of Professor Elizabeth Santos, who had examined the pendant nearly 30 years earlier, stood directing her crews with the grim efficiency of someone fighting a battle she knew she couldn't win. "It started in the evidence vault," she told Hoffman as they watched the building burn. "Same pattern as the 98 fire. Basement storage spreading upward faster than should be possible. We've lost everything from 1985 to 2005. What about the Elena Vasquez file?" Chief Santos gave him a look that mixed professional concern with something deeper, recognition perhaps of a legacy passed down through her family. "That's the strange thing, Ray. Just like last time, one section of the evidence room survived completely intact. Same file, same evidence, not even smoke damage." As dawn broke over the ruins of the second police headquarters in 12 years, Hoffman found himself standing in familiar devastation. The evidence vault was a blackened shell, its metal shelving twisted into abstract sculptures by the intense heat. But in the exact center of the destruction, a single filing cabinet stood untouched, its drawers closed and its surface unmarked by flame or smoke. Inside, the Elena Vasquez file waited with patient persistence. Detective Chen, a 20-year veteran who had heard whispers about the ghost file throughout her career, opened the folder with hands that trembled slightly. The photograph was pristine, showing Elena's broken form in the desert wash with that mysterious figure barely visible in the background shadows. The pendant, still in its evidence bag, seemed to pulse with dark satisfaction. "Ray," Chen said quietly, "look at this." She was holding a second photograph, one that hadn't been in the file the last time Hoffman had seen it. This image showed the interior of a morgue, empty drawers hanging open like gaping mouths. On the floor, barely visible in the poor lighting, was what appeared to be a trail of wet footprints leading from one of the drawers to the exit door. "Where did this come from?" Hoffman asked. "It was clipped to the back of the original photo," Chen replied. "Like someone wanted us to find it now after all these years." The footprints in the photograph were small, delicate and unmistakably feminine. They led in a straight line from the drawer that had once held Elena Vasquez's body to the door, with no deviation, no hesitation. But what made Hoffman's blood run cold was the realization that the footprints appeared wet, as if they'd been made by feet that had been soaking in something for a very long time. Over the following weeks, as investigators combed through the ashes of the second fire, more anomalies emerged. Security cameras throughout the building had malfunctioned exactly 17 minutes before the fire started, the same 17 minutes that had marked the duration of Elena's final moments of life. Temperature sensors had recorded impossible readings, with some areas reaching nearly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, while others remained mysteriously cool. But perhaps most disturbing was the discovery made by Fire Marshal Tony Rodriguez in the deepest part of the basement. Burned into the concrete floor, in letters 2 feet tall, was a message in the same ancient script that adorned Elena's pendant. Professor Santos, now in her 80s but still sharp, translated it with growing unease. "She calls to us," was the rough translation. "She calls from the deep places, from the spaces between sleep and waking. Soon the circle closes." Detective Chen brought this translation to Hoffman at his desert home, finding the old detective sitting on his porch, watching the sunset paint the Catalina Mountains in shades of red and gold. "Ray, I think we need to face the possibility that Elena Vasquez isn't just a cold case anymore," Chen said, settling into the chair beside him. "Something is building toward a conclusion, and these fires are just the beginning." Hoffman nodded, his weathered hands turning the pendant over in its evidence bag. After the second fire, he'd insisted on keeping it at his house, convinced that the police station wasn't safe for such an artifact. The pendant had been quiet since then, but he could feel its presence like a weight on his conscience. "Lisa, I need to tell you something I never put in the official reports," he said. "The night Elena died, I had a dream. I was standing in that desert wash where we found her, but it wasn't day anymore. It was night, and there were others there, dozens of people, all carrying the same pendant, all walking towards something I couldn't see. What do you think it means? I think Elena Vasquez has been dead for 30 years, but she's not finished with us yet, and I think these fires are her way of keeping the case alive until someone figures out what she's trying to tell us." As if responding to his words, the pendant began to emit that familiar humming sound, barely audible but felt deep in their bones. In the distance, coyotes began to howl, their voices carrying across the desert like an ancient chorus welcoming the night. Chen shivered despite the warm evening air. "Ray, what if she's not trying to tell us something? What if she's trying to bring us somewhere?" Hoffman had been wondering the same thing for 29 years. As the stars emerged overhead, brilliant and cold in the desert sky, he suspected they would soon find out. Detective Sarah Martinez had always been fascinated by cold cases, but she'd never expected to inherit one that came with its own supernatural reputation. At 34, she was part of a new generation of investigators who approached mysteries with cutting-edge technology and data analysis, tools that previous generations could never have imagined. The Tucson Police Department's new headquarters, built after the 2010 fire, housed a state-of-the-art digital forensics lab where Sarah spent most of her time. The Elena Vasquez file had been fully digitized, scanned at high resolution, and uploaded to multiple secure servers, an attempt to preserve it against any future accidents that might befall the physical evidence. It was Tuesday, October 13, 2015, when Sarah first ran the case photograph through the department's new facial recognition software. The technology had advanced dramatically in recent years, capable of analyzing facial features even when severely damaged or distorted. What she discovered would change everything. "Computer, enhance facial recognition parameters," Sarah commanded, watching as the software mapped Elena's swollen features onto a three-dimensional model. Despite the damage, the program was able to extrapolate bone structure, eye spacing, and other immutable characteristics. The search parameters expanded to include missing persons reports, driver's license photos, and passport records dating back to 1960. Sarah expected either no matches or perhaps a hit from some long-lost missing person report that previous investigators had missed. She did not expect the computer to chime with a positive identification in less than 30 seconds. "Match found," the synthesized voice announced. "Elena Maria Vasquez, born March 15, 1953, last known address, 2847 Desert View Road, Tucson, Arizona." Sarah stared at the screen, her coffee growing cold in her hand. The photograph that appeared alongside the facial recognition data showed a young woman with Elena's exact features, but this picture had been taken for a driver's license issued in 1978. According to the records, Elena Vasquez had been reported missing by her landlord on June 15, 1981, the same day she'd been found dying in the desert wash. But that wasn't the part that made Sarah's hands shake as she reached for her phone. According to the database, Elena Vasquez had been officially pronounced dead in a car accident on June 12, 1981, 3 days before she'd been found alive in the desert. Detective Chen answered on the second ring. "Sarah, what's wrong? You sound like you've seen a ghost." "Lisa, I need you to come down to the lab immediately. And can you call Ray Hoffman? I think he's going to want to see this." An hour later, the three investigators stood around Sarah's computer workstation, staring at an impossible timeline that defied every law of logic and physics they understood. "Run it again," Hoffman said, his voice barely above a whisper. Despite his 78 years, his eyes were sharp as he studied the data scrolling across the screen. Sarah pulled up the motor vehicle records. Elena Vasquez, age 28, died June 12, 1981, when her car went off the road during a thunderstorm about 40 miles north of Tucson. Vehicle found submerged in a flash floodwash, body recovered and positively identified through dental records. She clicked to another screen. Same Elena Vasquez, found alive but critically injured June 15, 1981, in a different wash 15 miles northeast of the city, died 3 days later at Tucson Medical Center. "That's impossible," Chen muttered. "Someone can't die twice." "There's more," Sarah continued, pulling up autopsy records that had been digitized from the motor vehicle accident. According to the 1981 autopsy, Elena Vasquez had been dead for at least 48 hours when her body was recovered from the car. But look at this. She overlaid the autopsy photos with the hospital photographs taken when Elena was brought in from the desert. Despite the severe facial trauma, certain identifying marks were unmistakable: a small scar above the left eyebrow, a distinctive birthmark on the neck, and most importantly, dental work that matched exactly. "Same person," Hoffman said quietly. "But according to the evidence, she died in a car accident, was buried in Riverside Cemetery on June 16th, then was found alive in the desert the day before her own funeral." Sarah had spent the morning checking every database available to modern law enforcement. Elena's social security number had been inactive since her reported death in 1981. Her bank accounts had been closed by probate court. Her apartment had been cleaned out and re-rented. For all official purposes, Elena Vasquez had been dead and buried for 34 years. "I want to see the grave," Chen said suddenly. Riverside Cemetery sat on the eastern edge of Tucson, where the city met the desert in a buffer zone of old graves and older memories. The cemetery records showed that Elena Vasquez had been buried in Section 7, Plot 142, in a simple ceremony attended only by her landlord and a priest from St. Augustine Cathedral. The grave was easy to find, marked by a modest granite headstone that read, "Elena Maria Vasquez, 1953-1981, may she find peace." The dates matched the motor vehicle death perfectly, with no acknowledgement of the woman who had been found alive 3 days later. But when the cemetery groundskeeper, an elderly man named Marcus Webb, grandson of the professor who had studied similar artifacts decades earlier, led them to the plot, they discovered something that made their investigation take another impossible turn. "Strangest thing," Webb said, leaning on his shovel as he studied the grave. "Every year on June 15th, someone leaves fresh flowers here, desert blooms, nothing you can buy at a florist. And the strange thing is, we've never seen who does it." The flowers were there now, despite the fact that it was October. Desert marigolds and brittlebush, vibrant yellow and orange blooms that seemed to glow against the weathered granite. They looked like they'd been picked that morning, though both species had been out of season for months. "How long has this been happening?" Sarah asked. "Since she was buried, 34 years ago, every June 15th, without fail. We've put up cameras, had security guards watch, but we never catch anyone. The flowers just appear at dawn, like the desert itself is paying its respects." As they walked back to their cars, Sarah felt the weight of the pendant in her jacket pocket. She'd insisted on carrying it, despite Hoffman's warnings about its effects on people who got too close to the mystery. The artifact had been quiet during their cemetery visit, but now it was beginning to emit that familiar humming sound that seemed to resonate in her bones. "Sarah," Hoffman said as they reached the parking lot, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you been having any unusual dreams since you started working this case?" She stopped walking, her hand unconsciously moving to the pendant. "How did you know?" "Because Elena's not done with us yet, and I think she's been waiting 34 years for technology advanced enough to tell her story." That night, Sarah would dream of walking through the desert under a star-filled sky, following the sound of distant voices calling her name. In her dream, she carried a pendant that pulsed with dark light, leading her towards something that waited in the shadows between the saguaro cacti. Something that looked like Elena Vasquez, but wasn't quite human anymore. The dreams came every night now, growing more vivid and insistent with each passing hour. Detective Sarah Martinez found herself waking at 3:17 a.m., the exact time Elena had died 34 years earlier, with the taste of desert sand in her mouth and the sound of ancient voices echoing in her ears. In her dreams, she walked through landscapes that were familiar yet wrong, as if the Sonoran desert had been filtered through the lens of another world. The saguaro cacti stretched toward a sky filled with too many stars, and the sand beneath her feet whispered secrets in languages that predated human civilization. But it was the figure that waited for her in these dreams that truly frightened Sarah. A woman who looked like Elena Vasquez, but whose eyes held depths that no living person should possess. She stood among the creosote bushes, always just out of reach, gesturing for Sarah to follow her deeper into the desert's heart. "You have to stop sleeping," Detective Chen said bluntly when Sarah arrived at work after another restless night. "You look like hell, and you're starting to scare the other officers." Sarah caught her reflection in the break room mirror and had to admit Chen was right. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her eyes were rimmed with dark circles that makeup couldn't hide. More disturbing was the way her gaze seemed to drift toward the window that faced the desert, as if something out there was calling her. "I've been researching the pendant," Sarah said, pulling out a thick folder filled with printouts and scholarly articles. "The markings aren't just decorative. According to several sources, they're a form of ancient binding spell designed to anchor souls who died before their time." Chen frowned. "You're starting to sound like you believe this supernatural nonsense. I'm starting to think we don't have a choice." Sarah spread the papers across her desk, pointing to highlighted passages from archaeological journals and religious texts. "Look at this. Similar artifacts have been found at sites across the world, always associated with unexplained deaths and disappearances. The common thread is that people who come into contact with them report dreams, visions, and an irresistible urge to travel to specific locations. Sarah, you're talking about magic. Real police work deals with evidence and facts. Then explain the facts. Sarah pulled out the Elena Vasquez file, spreading the photographs across her desk like tarot cards. A woman dies in a car accident, is buried, then is found alive 3 days later in a different location. She dies again. Her body disappears from the morgue, and for 34 years someone or something has been leaving flowers on her grave. Chen studied the photographs, her skepticism warring with the evidence before her. Even if I accept that something supernatural is happening, what are we supposed to do about it? Arrest a ghost? Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. Detective Martinez, this is Marcus Webb from Riverside Cemetery. You need to come here immediately. Something's happened to Elena Vasquez's grave. They arrived at the cemetery to find a small crowd gathered around Section 7. Marcus Webb met them at the entrance, his face pale and his hands shaking as he led them toward the disturbance. It happened sometime during the night, he explained as they walked between the weathered headstones. Groundskeepers found it this morning when they came to work. Elena's grave had been opened from the inside. The earth around the headstone was pushed outward in a perfect circle, as if something had erupted from below with tremendous force. The casket, visible in the gaping hole, had been split open from within, its satin lining shredded and stained with something that looked like mud mixed with old blood. But the casket was empty. "Where's the body?" Chen asked, though her voice suggested she already knew the answer would be impossible. "That's just it," Webb replied. "According to our records, Elena Vasquez's casket should have contained her remains. But when we checked with the funeral home this morning, they found something strange in their files." He handed Sarah a yellow document from 1981. The original burial order was changed at the last minute. Instead of Elena Vasquez's body, they buried an empty casket. The funeral director's notes say the family requested it after the body was claimed by relatives in Mexico. "But there was no family," Sarah said, remembering the original case files. "Elena was alone in Tucson. No relatives ever came forward. That's what makes this so strange. Someone signed for the body using the name E. Vasquez, but the signature doesn't match any records we have on file. It's like Elena Vasquez claimed her own body." Sarah knelt beside the open grave, studying the disturbed earth. Mixed in with the dirt were fragments of something that looked like bone, but when she picked up a piece for closer examination, it crumbled to dust at her touch. The pendant in her pocket began to hum with increasing intensity, and she realized that the sound was in harmony with something else, a low vibration coming from deep within the earth itself. "Lisa," she said quietly, "I think we need to find out where Elena's body really went in 1981. That afternoon they tracked down the funeral director who had handled Elena's burial. Roberto Santos, now in his 70s and fighting the early stages of dementia, remembered the case with startling clarity when they showed him the photographs. "Strangest thing in 40 years of business," he said, settling into his wheelchair in the lobby of the Sunset Manor nursing home. "Beautiful young woman came in the day before the burial, said she was Elena's sister from Hermosillo, had all the proper paperwork, death certificate, family authorization, everything." "Do you remember what she looked like?" Sarah asked. Santos nodded slowly. "That's what made it so strange. She looked exactly like the photos of Elena that the police had shown me. I mean exactly. Same height, same build, same facial features. I figured they were twins maybe, but something about her gave me the chills." "What do you mean?" "She was too cold. Not unfriendly, just physically cold. When she shook my hand, it was like touching ice. And her eyes." Santos shuddered. "They were black, not brown, like in the photos. Black as desert stones." Chen leaned forward. "What happened to the body?" "She said she was taking Elena back to Mexico for burial in the family plot. I helped load the casket into a hearse, an old black one that looked like it belonged in a museum. But here's the thing that still bothers me. When I touched that casket, I could swear I heard something moving around inside." As they left the nursing home, Sarah felt the pendant's humming grow stronger. The desert stretched out before them, vast and eternal under the afternoon sun, and somewhere in its depths, she knew Elena Vasquez was waiting. That night, the dreams came again, but this time they were different. Elena stood in the same wash where she'd been found in 1981, but now she wasn't alone. Behind her, barely visible in the moonlight, stood dozens of other figures. men and women of various ages, all holding pendants that pulsed with the same dark light. In the dream, Elena finally spoke, her voice carrying across the desert like wind through stone. "The circle must be closed, Detective Martinez. 34 years I have waited for one who could see the truth. Come to us. Come to where it all began." Sarah woke at 3:17 a.m., but this time she didn't go back to sleep. She dressed quietly, checked her service weapon, and drove out into the desert night, following roads that seemed to lead themselves toward the wash where Elena Vasquez had first been found. Behind her, the lights of Tucson faded into the distance, and ahead the desert waited with ancient patience for the circle to finally close. The desert road stretched endlessly ahead of Sarah's patrol car, its asphalt surface shimmering like water under the light of a full moon that seemed too bright, too close. She'd been driving for over an hour, following instincts she couldn't explain, and roads that didn't appear on any GPS system. The pendant in her pocket had grown warm against her leg, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. At 2:30 a.m. she found the turnoff, a dirt track that branched away from the main road and disappeared into a maze of saguaro cacti and boulder formations. Her headlights swept across a landscape that looked familiar from 34 years of police photographs, and she realized with growing certainty that she was approaching the wash where Elena Vasquez had first been discovered. But this wasn't the empty desert that Detective Hoffman had found in 1981. Parked along the dirt road were vehicles from different eras: a 1970s sedan with rusted chrome, a pickup truck from the 1990s, a modern SUV with out-of-state plates. Their owners were nowhere to be seen, but Sarah could feel their presence in the desert air like electricity before a thunderstorm. She parked her patrol car at the end of the line and stepped out into the night. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the whisper of wind through the cacti. But as she walked toward the wash, following a path that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, she began to hear voices. They were speaking in the same ancient language that Elena had used during her final moments at the hospital, words that predated Spanish and English, sounds that seemed to come from the earth itself. The pendant in her pocket grew warmer with each step, and Sarah realized that she was no longer walking alone. Shadows moved between the desert plants, keeping pace with her but staying just out of direct sight. They were human-shaped but wrong somehow, as if they were reflections of people rather than people themselves. When she tried to look directly at them, they faded like mirages, but she could feel their eyes following her progress toward the wash. The voices grew louder as she approached the edge of the arroyo, and when she looked down into the sandy bottom, Sarah saw something that made her question her sanity. Dozens of people stood in a perfect circle around the spot where Elena had been found 34 years earlier. They ranged in age from teenagers to elderly adults, dressed in clothing from different decades, all united by the pendants that hung around their necks. The artifacts pulsed with synchronized dark light, creating a rhythm that seemed to make the desert itself breathe. At the center of the circle stood Elena Vasquez. She looked exactly as she had in the hospital photographs, but the injuries were gone. Her face was whole and beautiful, her dark hair flowing in a wind that Sarah couldn't feel. When she turned toward the detective standing on the rim of the wash, her eyes held depths that reflected not just moonlight, but starlight from skies that might have existed before the earth was born. "Detective Martinez," Elena called, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "We have been waiting for you." Sarah felt her hand move toward her service weapon, but the motion seemed to happen in slow motion, as if she were moving through thick water. The pendant in her pocket had grown almost hot now, and she could hear it humming in harmony with the others below. "Who are you people?" Sarah called back, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "We are the chosen," Elena replied, gesturing to the figures around her. "Those who carried the burden of the deep knowledge, who were marked by the ancient powers that sleep beneath the desert. Some of us have been here for decades, others for centuries. All of us died before our time, called back to serve a purpose greater than our mortal lives." One of the figures in the circle stepped forward, a young man in clothing from the 1960s, his pendant gleaming against his chest. "I was Thomas Mitchell," he said, and Sarah recognized the name from the case files, the security guard who had been on duty when Elena's body disappeared from the morgue. "I died of a heart attack in 1987, 6 years after I let her walk out of that building, but she called me back." Another figure spoke, an elderly woman whose pendant seemed older than the others. "Maria Santos, 1934. I found the first pendant in these hills when I was 7 years old. I've been waiting here for 81 years for the circle to be complete." As each figure spoke, Sarah began to understand the scope of what she was witnessing. These weren't ghosts in any traditional sense. They were people who had been marked by contact with the pendants, drawn to this place over the span of nearly a century to fulfill some ancient purpose that predated human civilization in the Southwest. "What do you want from me?" Sarah asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Elena smiled, and her expression held both sadness and terrible patience. "You are the last detective, the one who would finally piece together the truth and bring the circle to completion. The pendant chose you just as it chose all of us." Sarah felt the artifact pulse against her leg, and suddenly she understood. The pendant hadn't been evidence in a criminal case. It had been bait, drawing investigators deeper into the mystery until one of them proved capable of seeing the full truth. The fires that had protected Elena's file, the impossible timeline of her death and resurrection, the dreams that had been calling Sarah to this place, all of it had been orchestrated to bring her here, to this moment. "I won't join you," Sarah said, finally managing to draw her weapon. "Whatever you are, whatever you want, I'm still a police officer." Elena's expression didn't change. "Look around you, detective. Really look." Sarah glanced at the vehicles parked along the road behind her, and her blood ran cold. Among them was a Tucson Police Department patrol car, not her own, but an older model from the 1990s. As she watched, the driver's door opened, and Detective Lisa Chen stepped out. But it wasn't the Chen that Sarah knew. This version was younger, wearing a uniform from 20 years ago, and her eyes held the same impossible depths as Elena's. Around her neck hung a pendant, identical to the others. "Lisa died in 1995, Elena explained gently. "Car accident on Interstate 10 responding to a domestic violence call. But she had touched my file, had seen my photograph, and the pendant called her back. She's been waiting here for 20 years for you to join us." Sarah felt the world spinning around her as more figures emerged from the desert shadows. Detective Hoffman, looking as he had in his prime, wearing the same clothes he'd worn the day he found Elena in 1981. Professor Elizabeth Santos, holding the pendant she had examined in her university office. Dr. Patricia Reeves from the hospital, still wearing her surgical scrubs. All dead, all called back, all waiting for her. "The choice is yours, Detective Martinez," Elena said, extending her hand. "Join us willingly and help us complete the circle that has been forming for over a century, or resist, and we will simply wait for the next investigator to take your place." Sarah looked at the pendant in Elena's outstretched palm, its dark stone seeming to pulse with the heartbeat of the desert itself. Around them, the gathering of the dead waited with infinite patience for her decision. Sarah's mind reeled as she processed the impossible truth surrounding her. Every person she had worked with on this case, every expert she had consulted, every colleague she had trusted, all of them had been dead for years, existing only as supernatural echoes drawn back by the power of the pendants. "You're lying," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I spoke with Chen yesterday. I've been working with her for months." Elena's expression remained patient, understanding. "Time moves differently for us, Detective. What seems like months to you has been mere moments in our existence. We appear when the pendant calls us. We interact with the living world just enough to guide the investigation forward. Then we return here to wait." As if to demonstrate Elena's words, Detective Chen stepped forward from the group of figures surrounding the wash. But now Sarah could see the truth. Chen's uniform was faded and torn, stained with blood from the accident that had killed her 20 years earlier. Her badge was tarnished black, and when she spoke, her voice carried the hollow echo of wind through empty places. "I'm sorry, Sarah," the ghostly Chen said. "I wanted to tell you the truth, but the pendant wouldn't let me. We can only reveal ourselves when the circle is ready to close." Sarah backed away from the edge of the wash, her weapon still drawn, though she knew it would be useless against the assembled dead. "What is this circle? What do you want?" Elena raised her pendant, and its dark stone began to glow with increasing intensity. Around the circle, the other artifacts responded in kind, creating a web of pulsing light that seemed to reach deep into the earth beneath their feet. "Long before your people came to this desert," Elena began, "before the Spanish, before the native tribes that you know, there were others. They came from beyond the stars, seeking a place to rest until the cosmos aligned for their return. They chose this place because the barriers between worlds are thin here, where the desert meets the sky." The pendant in Sarah's pocket grew hot enough to burn, but she found she couldn't remove it. The artifact had somehow fused itself to her clothing, to her very flesh, marking her as permanently as it had marked all the others. These beings left guardians, Elena continued, anchors to hold their sleeping place secure until the time of awakening. The pendants are fragments of their essence, scattered across the world to find those who could serve as eternal sentinels. Professor Santos stepped from the circle, her academic demeanor intact despite the supernatural circumstances. The Syrian dig I told Detective Hoffman about was just one of many sites where these artifacts have been found. Each pendant calls its chosen to a specific location, binding them to guard the deep places where the ancient ones sleep. "You're talking about alien gods," Sarah said, the words feeling ridiculous even as she spoke them. "We're talking about forces so old that human language has no adequate terms for them," Elena replied. "They existed when the earth was young, and they will exist when the sun grows cold. We are simply the caretakers of their slumber." The ground beneath Sarah's feet began to vibrate, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from miles below the surface. Around the circle, the dead raised their pendants in unison, and the artifact's combined light created a pillar of darkness that stretched from the desert floor to the star-filled sky above. "For 93 years we have been gathering," Elena said, her voice rising above the growing rumble from underground. "One by one, the pendants have called their chosen to this place. Scientists, police officers, archaeologists, doctors, anyone whose curiosity or sense of duty made them suitable guardians." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, her surgical scrubs now clearly stained with the blood of her own death decades earlier. "I was chosen because I tried to save Elena's life, because I showed compassion for the suffering. That compassion made me suitable to watch over beings whose dreams could destroy worlds if they were disturbed. And I was chosen because I sought the truth," added Detective Hoffman, his weathered face serene in the pendant's glow. "Every good investigator leaves part of themselves in their cases. The pendant simply claimed that part and made it eternal." Sarah felt her resistance weakening as the pendant's influence grew stronger. The artifact was showing her visions now, glimpses of vast cities that existed between dimensions, of creatures whose thoughts moved like slow music across cons of time, of a purpose so much greater than her human concerns that individual identity seemed petty and small. "Why now?" she asked, fighting to maintain her sense of self against the pendant's call. "Why is the circle closing after nearly a century?" Elena smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had in the hospital photographs, young, human, vulnerable. "Because they are beginning to stir. Deep beneath the desert, in chambers that predate continental drift, the ancient ones are starting to wake. The circle must be complete before they open their eyes, or their awakening will shatter the barriers that keep their power contained." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. If these entities were as powerful as Elena suggested, their uncontrolled awakening could devastate not just Tucson, but potentially the entire world. The pendant around her neck, when had she put it on, pulsed with approval as she grasped the true scope of their purpose. "We are not their servants," Elena continued, reading Sarah's thoughts. "We are their guardians, their protectors. Without us to maintain the vigil, their dreams will leak into the waking world, bringing madness and destruction to everything you hold dear." Around the circle, the other chosen began to chant in the ancient language that had haunted Sarah's dreams. The words seemed to reshape reality itself, creating harmonics that resonated through dimensions she hadn't known existed. The pendant against her chest grew warm with purpose, and she felt her resistance crumbling like sand in a desert wind. "The choice remains yours, Detective Martinez," Elena said, extending her hand once more. "Join us willingly, and your sacrifice will help preserve the world you've sworn to protect. Refuse, and the circle will remain incomplete until another investigator takes your place. But by then it may be too late." Sarah looked around at the gathered dead, seeing them clearly for the first time. They weren't monsters or demons, but people who had made the ultimate sacrifice to protect humanity from forces beyond comprehension. Chen gave her an encouraging nod. Hoffman smiled with paternal pride. Professor Santos watched with scholarly curiosity to see what choice Sarah would make. In the distance, barely audible beneath the chanting, Sarah could hear something else, a sound like breathing, vast and slow, coming from deep beneath the earth. The ancient ones were indeed beginning to stir, and soon their long sleep would end. The pendant around her neck pulsed with urgent need. The circle was almost complete, lacking only her conscious acceptance to fulfill its ancient purpose. Below them, something older than human civilization waited to wake from dreams that could unmake reality itself. Sarah lowered her weapon and looked at Elena's outstretched hand, knowing that her next decision would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everything she had ever cared about. Sarah stared at Elena's outstretched hand, feeling the weight of eternity pressing down upon her shoulders. The pendant around her neck, she still couldn't remember putting it on, pulsed with warmth that spread through her chest like liquid fire. Around the circle, the dead waited with infinite patience, their own pendants creating a constellation of dark light against the desert night. "If I join you," Sarah said, her voice barely audible above the growing vibrations from beneath the earth, "what happens to my life, my family, the people who care about me?" Elena's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "They will believe you died in the line of duty, a car accident perhaps, or a confrontation with a dangerous suspect. The pendant will arrange the details, just as it did for all of us. Your sacrifice will be honored but forgotten, as all great sacrifices must be. But I'll still exist, still be me? You will be more than you ever were in life," Detective Hoffman said, stepping closer to the edge of the circle. "We retain our memories, our personalities, our essential selves, but we also gain understanding of truths that the living mind cannot comprehend. You will see the patterns that connect all things, feel the pulse of forces that shape the cosmos itself." Dr. Reeves nodded in agreement. "The transition is not death, Detective. It's evolution. We become something between human and the ancient ones, bridges that allow their power to remain contained while keeping our world safe." The ground beneath them shuddered more violently, and hairline cracks appeared in the desert floor around the wash. From these fissures came a faint luminescence that hurt to look at directly, colors that had no names in any human language. The ancient ones were indeed stirring, and their partial awakening was already beginning to affect reality in ways that mortal senses could barely perceive. "How long?" Sarah asked. "How long would I have to maintain this vigil?" Elena's smile carried the weight of eons. "Until the cosmos turns full circle and brings the ancient ones to their final rest. Perhaps 1,000 years, perhaps 1,000,000. Time moves differently for us. What seems like eternity to human perception feels like moments when you exist outside the normal flow of existence." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what was being asked of her. Everything she had worked for, everyone she cared about, would become memories preserved in amber, while she stood eternal guard over forces that could unmake creation itself. But the alternative, allowing these entities to wake without proper containment, could mean the end of everything she had sworn to protect. "There is something else you should know," Professor Santos said, her academic voice cutting through Sarah's internal struggle. "The circle we form is not just a prison, it's also a shield. Every major catastrophe that has been averted, every cosmic disaster that never quite materialized, every moment when the world teetered on the edge of destruction but somehow pulled back, that was us. That was the work of guardians like these, standing watch at other sites around the world." The implications hit Sarah like a revelation. The pendant she wore wasn't unique. There were others scattered across the globe, each maintaining its own circle of guardians, each protecting humanity from forces that existed beyond normal comprehension. She wasn't being asked to join a death cult, but to become part of an ancient order that had been protecting the world since civilization began. "You would not be alone," Elena continued, as if reading her thoughts. "We are connected to our brothers and sisters at other sites, other circles maintaining their own vigils. Through the pendants, we share knowledge, wisdom, and the burden of our responsibility." The chanting around the circle grew louder, more urgent, as the cracks in the desert floor widened. Something vast and alien stirred in the depths below, its dreams beginning to leak into the physical world. In the distance, coyotes howled in harmonies that shouldn't have been possible, and the stars themselves seemed to pulse in rhythm with the pendant's dark light. "Decide quickly, Detective Martinez," Elena urged. "The window of opportunity is closing. Soon the ancient ones will be too awake for us to safely complete the circle." Sarah opened her eyes and looked at each of the figures surrounding the wash. These people had all made the same choice she now faced, sacrificing their individual lives for the greater good of humanity. They had found loved ones, career ambitions, personal dreams, all given up to stand eternal guard against cosmic horror. But as she studied their faces, Sarah realized something that surprised her. Despite their supernatural nature, despite the terrible burden they carried, they looked peaceful, content even. There was a serenity in their expressions that she had never seen in the living world, a sense of purpose so profound that it transformed sacrifice into fulfillment. "If I refuse," she said, "how long before you find someone else?" Elena's expression grew grave. "There may not be time for someone else. The investigation has reached its natural conclusion. Another detective might not be drawn to the case for months or years, and by then," she gestured to the growing luminescence seeping from the cracks in the earth, "by then it will be too late." The pendant around Sarah's neck began to burn with cold fire, and suddenly she could feel what Elena felt, the vast presence stirring miles beneath the desert, ancient beyond measure and terrible in its power. Without the complete circle to contain it, that presence would continue to wake, and its full awakening would bring madness and destruction to every living thing on Earth. Sarah thought of her partner Chen, the real Chen, who had died 20 years ago but had returned to guide her to this moment. She thought of Detective Hoffman, who had carried this burden alone for decades before the circle began to form around him. She thought of all the innocent people in Tucson who slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that cosmic forces threatened their very existence. "I need to know one more thing," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Will I remember this choice? Will I remember choosing to protect them?" Elena nodded solemnly. "You will remember everything, Detective. The choice, the reason, the love that motivated your sacrifice. That memory will sustain you through the long watches, remind you why your vigil matters." Sarah looked one last time at the lights of Tucson twinkling in the distance, at the world she had spent her career protecting through conventional means. Then she stepped forward and took Elena's outstretched hand. The moment their fingers touched, Sarah felt herself changing. The transformation was not painful, quite the opposite. It was like coming home after a long journey, like finally understanding a mystery that had haunted her since childhood. Her human concerns didn't disappear, but they took their proper place in a cosmic perspective that made her previous understanding of reality seem like a child's picture book. Around the circle, the other guardians raised their pendants in salute as Sarah's own artifact blazed with triumphant light. The cracks in the desert floor began to seal themselves, the alien luminescence fading as the Ancient Ones settled back into their protected slumber. "Welcome, Guardian Martinez," Elena said, her voice now carrying harmonics that resonated across dimensions. "The circle is complete. The watch begins anew." As the immediate crisis passed and the desert returned to its natural stillness, Sarah felt the weight of eternity settle around her like a comfortable cloak. She was no longer Detective Sarah Martinez of the Tucson Police Department. She was something more, a sentinel standing guard between worlds, a protector of humanity's dreams, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly at peace. Time flowed differently in the circle of guardians. What had once been measured in heartbeats and breathing now moved in the rhythm of deeper things, the slow dance of celestial bodies, the patient pulse of geological change, the measured breathing of the Ancient Ones in their cosmic sleep. Sarah stood in her position within the circle, her human form maintained but transformed. She could feel her consciousness expanding, touching the minds of her fellow guardians, sharing in their collective knowledge and purpose. Through Elena, she experienced the weight of centuries. Through Detective Hoffman, she understood the satisfaction of a mystery finally solved. Through Professor Santos, she gained access to scholarly understanding that spanned multiple lifetimes. The desert around them appeared unchanged to any hypothetical observer, but Sarah could now perceive the layers of reality that existed beyond normal human sight. The wash where Elena had first been found was revealed as a nexus point, a place where the barriers between dimensions grew thin. Beneath the sand and stone, vast chambers stretched into the Earth's core, holding sleeping forms that defied geometric understanding. "The hardest part," Elena said, her voice carrying directly into Sarah's mind, "is learning to think in cosmic time while remembering to care about human moments." Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of that statement. Already her former life seemed distant, like a half-remembered dream, but the pendant around her neck helped her maintain connection to her human emotions, ensuring that love and compassion remained central to her purpose. Through their supernatural connection to law enforcement databases, the Guardians arranged Sarah's official fate. Detective Sarah Martinez was reported killed in a single car accident on a remote desert road. Her vehicle found burned beyond recognition after apparently hitting a flash floodwash during a sudden storm. The investigation was brief and conclusive, another tragic reminder of the dangers that faced police officers in Arizona's unforgiving landscape. Her funeral was attended by colleagues who remembered her dedication, family members who mourned a life cut short, and friends who celebrated her service to the community. The American flag draped over her empty casket was folded with military precision and presented to her parents with the gratitude of a city she had died protecting. They would never know how literally true that sentiment had become. From her position in the circle, Sarah could observe the world she had left behind. She watched her replacement, Detective Michael Torres, grandson of her former colleague, take over her caseload with the same determination she had once shown. She saw her family grieving, then slowly healing, carrying forward the memory of a daughter and sister who had given her life in service to others. But she also saw threats that the living world couldn't perceive, other ancient sites around the globe where similar circles maintained their vigils, places where the barriers between realities grew thin and required constant attention. Through the network of guardians, she learned of cosmic storms that threatened to wake the sleeping entities, of dimensional rifts that required immediate sealing, of reality distortions that needed careful management. The work was endless and essential. Months passed, then years, though the distinction meant little to beings who existed outside normal time. Sarah learned to project herself into the living world when necessary, appearing as a helpful witness or an anonymous tip-caller when investigations threatened to uncover truths that humanity wasn't ready to face. Like the others, she became a guardian not just of the Ancient One's slumber, but of humanity's innocence. On the anniversary of Elena's original death, June 15th, Sarah joined the yearly ritual that had puzzled groundskeepers for decades. The guardians manifested in the physical world just long enough to place fresh desert flowers on Elena's grave, honoring the woman whose death had initiated their circle's formation. It was a reminder that they had once been human, that their sacrifice had meaning beyond cosmic duty. During these visits, Sarah sometimes encountered Detective Torres as he worked cases that brushed against the supernatural. Like his grandfather before him, he showed the curiosity and integrity that marked potential guardians. But Sarah hoped his path would lead elsewhere. The circle was complete, and there was no need for new members unless existing guardians were somehow destroyed. That possibility was always present. The Ancient Ones occasionally stirred in their sleep, sending nightmares and visions into the world above. When that happened, the Guardians had to project more of their essence into containment, sometimes weakening individual members to the point where they faded from existence entirely. It was a form of true death, one that even their supernatural state couldn't prevent. But for now the circle held strong. As Sarah settled into her eternal watch, she discovered unexpected joys in her transformed existence. She could perceive beauty in wavelengths of light that human eyes couldn't see. She could hear the music of planetary rotation, feel the poetry of gravitational waves, experience emotions that had no names in mortal language. The universe revealed itself as far more wondrous and terrible than she had ever imagined. Most importantly, she could feel the peace that came from knowing her choice had been the right one. Every morning that Tucson woke to normal sunlight, every child who played safely in desert schoolyards, every person who lived their life without fear of cosmic horror, all of it was possible because she and the other guardians maintained their watch. The Ancient Ones slept on, their dreams contained and their power held in check. The barriers between dimensions remained stable. Reality continued to function according to laws that protected human consciousness from truths it couldn't survive. And in a wash 15 miles northeast of Tucson, 11 figures stood in eternal vigil, their pendants pulsing with synchronized light as they guarded the sleeping gods and protected a world that would never know their names. Sarah Martinez had found her purpose at last. She had become something more than human, something beyond death, something essential to the continuation of everything she had ever loved. She had become a guardian of the deep places, and she would stand watch until the stars themselves grew cold. 50 years had passed since Detective Sarah Martinez had taken her place in the Circle of Guardians, though the passage of time felt like both an instant and an eternity from her transformed perspective. The Tucson of 2065 sprawled far beyond the boundaries she had known in life, its glass towers and solar collectors gleaming against the desert landscape like jewels scattered across ancient sand. But in the wash, 15 miles northeast of the city, time stood still. The 11 guardians maintained their eternal vigil, their forms visible only to those touched by supernatural sight or blessed with the specific blindness of approaching death. They had witnessed the rise and fall of technologies, the changing patterns of human civilization, the slow dance of climate and geography that reshaped the world around their sacred site. Through her connection to the global network of guardian circles, Sarah had observed wonders and horrors that would have shattered her mortal mind. She had seen the aurora-like energies that marked successful containments of cosmic storms. She had felt the dimensional earthquakes that occurred when ancient ones stirred in other sites around the world. She had participated in the collective effort that turned aside asteroid impacts, prevented nuclear wars, and gently guided human development away from technologies that might accidentally wake the sleeping gods. The work was endless, but it was good work. On this particular night, June 15, 2065, the 84th anniversary of Elena's original death, something was different. As the Guardians gathered to perform their yearly ritual at Elena's grave, Sarah felt a disturbance in the cosmic currents that surrounded their site. Not danger, exactly, but change, the kind of shift that marked significant transitions in the great patterns that governed reality. "Do you feel it?" Elena asked, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple dimensions. Sarah nodded, her enhanced senses detecting fluctuations in the energy fields that kept the Ancient Ones contained. "Something is coming, but not a threat." Detective Hoffman, now the senior guardian after decades of service, studied the readings that only their transformed consciousness could perceive. The deep sleepers are settling into a new phase of dormancy. Their dreams are growing quieter, more stable. Professor Santos, whose scholarly mind had never stopped analyzing the mysteries around them, offered her interpretation. The cosmic alignment is shifting. The forces that originally brought the Ancient Ones to Earth are moving into a configuration that will deepen their slumber for eons to come. The implications were staggering. For nearly a century, the Circle had maintained constant vigilance against the possibility of an awakening that could destroy human civilization. But if the Ancient Ones were entering a period of deeper sleep, the immediate threat they posed would diminish dramatically. "What does this mean for us?" asked Dr. Reeves, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Elena smiled, her face radiant with joy and ancient wisdom. "It means the first phase of our watch is ending. The crisis that brought us together has passed into a new stage, one that requires different guardians, different approaches." As if summoned by her words, new figures began to materialize in the desert around the wash. These were not the dead returned to life, but living humans who had been touched by supernatural forces and called to serve as the next generation of protectors. Sarah recognized the pattern. Just as the original circle had been drawn from various professions and backgrounds, these new guardians represented the skills and knowledge needed for the changing world. Among them was Detective Michael Torres, whose investigations into unusual phenomena had eventually led him to the truth about the supernatural forces at work in the desert. Beside him stood Dr. Jennifer Chen, daughter of the long-dead Detective Chen, whose research into quantum physics had brought her into contact with dimensional anomalies that required management. There were others too. An astronomer who had detected cosmic signals that weren't meant for human ears, a software engineer whose algorithms had accidentally accessed otherworldly data streams, a geologist whose deep drilling projects had come too close to chambers that should remain sealed. "The nature of the threats is evolving," Elena explained, as the two groups faced each other across the sacred ground. "Where once we needed to contain active supernatural forces, now the Guardians must monitor dormant ones. Where we once stood, physical watch, the new Guardians will maintain digital surveillance and scientific observation." Sarah understood. The world had changed dramatically since 1981, and the methods needed to protect it had changed as well. The new Guardians would use satellites and sensors, quantum computers and genetic analysis, space-based telescopes and deep Earth monitoring stations to watch for signs of disturbance in the Ancient One's slumber. "But what happens to us?" Sarah asked, though she felt the answer forming in her transformed consciousness even as she spoke the words. "We are released," Elena said simply. "Our service is complete. The sacrifice we made has borne fruit. Humanity is safe. The Ancient Ones sleep soundly and new protectors stand ready to continue the watch." The pendant around Sarah's neck began to pulse with warm light, but this time the sensation was different. Instead of the cold fire of binding and duty, she felt the gentle warmth of recognition and gratitude. The artifact that had marked her as a guardian was now acknowledging the completion of her service. One by one, the original guardians began to fade from their positions in the circle. Not dying, they had already passed beyond death, but moving on to whatever came after duty was fulfilled. Sarah felt no fear at this transition, only deep satisfaction and the anticipation of discoveries yet to come. As her form began to dissolve into starlight and cosmic wind, Sarah took one last look at the world she had protected for half a century. Tucson spread out below them, its lights twinkling like earthbound stars in the desert darkness. Somewhere among those lights, people slept peacefully in their beds, worked late shifts at hospitals and police stations, fell in love and raised families, and pursued dreams that would have been impossible if the ancient ones had awakened. Detective Michael Torres stepped forward to take Sarah's position in the new circle, his living form solid and warm, where hers had been ethereal and cool. Around him, the other new guardians took their places, their modern equipment and enhanced understanding ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. "Thank you," Torres said simply, speaking for all of humanity, whether he knew it or not. Sarah smiled as the last traces of her physical form dispersed into the desert night. She had been a police officer who had sought the truth, found it, and paid the ultimate price to protect others from knowledge they couldn't survive. But in losing her mortal life, she had gained something far greater, the satisfaction of service completed, duty fulfilled, and love expressed in its purest form. The pendant that had bound her to the circle dissolved into particles of light that danced briefly among the stars before fading into whatever dimension awaited guardians whose watch had ended. Around the wash, the new circle began their own eternal vigil, equipped with the tools and knowledge needed for a changing world. In the distance, coyotes howled their ancient songs to the desert moon, and the saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels in the moonlight. The Sonoran desert endured, as it always had, keeping its secrets safe beneath layers of sand and stone and time. And somewhere beyond the reach of human understanding, in the spaces between heartbeats and the gaps between stars, Sarah Martinez continued her journey. No longer guardian, no longer detective, but something new and wonderful that had no name in any earthly language. The circle endured, the watch continued, and the universe, vast and strange and terrible and beautiful, spun on through its cosmic dance, protected by those who chose to stand between the darkness and the light. The mystery of Elena Vasquez was finally completely solved.